Coming to you from an undisclosed location somewhere in the northern hemisphere, waiting out the alien apocalypse. He is armed with a machete and a microphone. This is the Mysterious Outpost.
Welcome to Mysterious Outpost Radio. I'm your not-so-homo host, Mike Blocker. Tonight on the show, I got none other than Joseph Farrell. You can go to his website at gizadestar.com. I'll get the links in the description below. Check it out for yourself. And he really doesn't need an introduction. Everybody knows who the man, Joseph Farrell, is. He has many books, Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery. He has Babylon Mysteries, The Cosmic War, the Giza Death Star, The Grid of the Gods. It goes on and on and on. This guy is spitting books out left and right. He is the myth, the legend. He is the conspiratola. He is the Ayatollah of conspiratola. He is my man, my bro. How you doing, Joseph Farrell? Welcome to the show, man.
After that introduction, I don't know. Thank you. I'm doing fine.
Like I say, especially with the guests that I like, I always say you're one of my favorite guests or one of my favorite researchers in general. So I feel like a fat kid in a candy store right now. But anyways, so we're going to talk a little bit about some ancient mysteries, kind of connect some of your books together, because I've told you before, and I've told other researchers about, or other videos I've made on YouTube, that your books connect together. They all intertwine. They all go together. And I love how you do that with your books. Was that in your intention when you started writing books however long ago?
Yeah, it was my intention. When I usually have pinned to my computer monitor a list of books that I've got projected, and usually it's about 3 or 4 ahead of what's actually out there.
Yeah,
and they are in a deliberate order. So yeah, they intentionally were written to kind of all fit together. Once you get into them, you'll see that, but it's hard to explain. And they were written in an order. You can read them in any order you want, but the order, more or less, that they were published in was the order I intended them to be read. But you don't have to read them in that order. You can start anywhere, and you'll see very quickly that they kind of dovetail into each other.
So we're going to be talking, like I said, a little bit about a mixture of your books, and maybe focus a little bit more on the covert wars and breakaway civilizations in here also. But to round things off, one thing I have noticed, Joseph, is that there is definitely a war going on for centuries between the good and the bad ETs. Like, one thing I've noticed with just a lot of people's researchers, or a lot of people's research, that there's a war going on between the good and bad ETs. But what is the primal reason for these conflicts between the gods, for the lack of a better term, since the ancient times? Like, what is the reason? Because there is a reason why we have so much infighting, so much violence, and in the world today. Like, what the hell's going on, man?
Well, I wrote a book called The Cosmic War a number of years ago, and I have stated on many occasions that I regard that book as kind of the keystone in the arch of all the books. In it, I try to examine a number of ancient texts, largely from Mesopotamia, some from Egypt, a couple of Hurrian texts, and so on. But basically, the bottom line, regardless of what tradition you look at, be it the biblical, be it the Babylonian, be it the Egyptian, is that it seems that mankind itself is somehow the centerpiece of this conflict. You look at the Babylonian text, and you see the gods like Enlil wanting to wipe out mankind. You see the god Enki pleading, don't wipe out mankind. You have the biblical story, of course, of the flood and so on and so forth. You've got the Islamic tradition that Lucifer or Satan, or I believe it's Imris or something like that. I forget the Muslim name for Satan, but in that version of the story, Satan actually becomes jealous of God having created man. And this is listed as one of the reasons for his revolt. So you've got this tradition that's more or less universal to that era and to that part of the world, that somehow mankind is at the center of this. The ultimate reason, I think, being that, if you take the biblical text or any of the other texts, they imply that there's something special created about man and about the creation of man. In the biblical tradition, of course, being made in the image and likeness of God. In the kind of esoteric tradition, it's because mankind is a blend of physical and spiritual being. He's not completely material. He's not completely spiritual or incorporeal like the angels or so on and so forth, but kind of a junction between the two types of creation. So that's very significant. That puts mankind in a very interesting place. You see the idea even reflected in some modern physics theory in the doctrine of the anthropic cosmology. In that cosmology, physicists have noted that if you look at the scale of everything from the very, very small, quantum mechanics up to galactic clusters and even the entire universe, in terms of mathematical definition of scale, mankind appears to fall almost exactly in the middle, which is yet another way of stating that ancient doctrine that man is the microcosm, the little universe. So yeah, there's something special about mankind, and I think if you weigh the whole panoply of all of these traditions, they all kind of point to the same thing. There's something special. Mankind is the battleground for this war.
Exactly. But and well said, Joseph. Do you think that we were genetically altered to be a violent and destructive race? Because if we were created in the image of our creator and after their likeness, does that mean that our creator is part of the bad ETs?
No, I think I'm a thoroughgoing theist on that score. I don't think God would have created something intentionally evil. I do subscribe to the idea of some sort of fall. And if you read the biblical text, if you read some of the Mesopotamian texts, you certainly get the idea that subsequently to the original creation, there was some sort of tinkering that happened with mankind. The Book of Enoch, in that respect, is very interesting because it clearly gives the impression that mankind's warlike ways had to be taught to him by whoever it was that made genetic modifications. I do think that there is something to the story of genetic modifications because, and I talked about this in a book called Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. If you look at the ancient Babylonian stories of this genetic engineering, what you see is that the human component of modern man was contributed or donated by 14, I believe it was, female donors. The so-called divine component was contributed by one male, Anunnaki or Nephilim or whatever you wish to call them, which is very interesting because if you start looking into modern genetics, they say almost, not quite, but almost the same thing because they've boiled down the Y chromosome, or pardon me, the X chromosome in mitochondrial DNA to about 13, I think it is, 13 or 14 haplogroups. So in other words, you have basically the idea that there's a kind of 14 clan mothers, if you will, to humanity. And geneticists have even gone so far as to start talking about mitochondrial Eve and so on and so forth. So the interesting thing here, that also tends to support the story is that some geneticists, and I go into this at much greater length in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing here is that they also talk about Y chromosomal Adam. And oddly enough, if you look at that genetic material, it appears to be older than modern man himself.
Mm-hmm.
So, where does this, where does this come in?
So Joseph,
And
I don't mean to interrupt you. Does that mean that the Adam that is mentioned in the Bible and other texts, they just use other names in other texts around the world? Does that mean that he is the genetically modified species that was already here on Earth? Because maybe there was already Neanderthal or other type of sapiens, whatever you want to call them, or other type of creatures already here, but they needed more of, I guess they wanted to get that spark, that intellectual spark, and that's why they created us in their image and after their likeness.
well, one of the things that, to a certain extent, the as I said, they took some pre-existing humanoid or hominid life form here on Earth that, to my way of thinking, would have had to have been genetically close enough to allow this to work.
Mm-hmm.
And by genetically close enough, I think you have to take into account breeding, sexuality, that would have allowed this species to propagate itself after you've tinkered with it. The divine component, as I said, came from the male, at least if you're following the Sumerian text. So that would indicate that whatever species that male may have represented would have had to have been close enough genetically to whatever they were using as sort of the feedstock, if I can put it crudely, for this genetic manipulation. If any of that's true, and I suspect there's a good deal to suggest it is, then this would tend to make the Y chromosome older than the human species itself, which is what they're saying. So there's all these little odd correlations between what they're finding out now and these ancient texts. The only difference between what they're talking about now and what the ancient texts are suggesting is the numbers of the female donors to this project. Now, the reason I stress this genetic compatibility is because the way I put it, I talk about genetic cousins. In other words, the species Homo sapiens sapiens is a species within the genus Homo, within the genus man. Mm-hmm. So in other words, what that's suggesting, what these ancient texts are suggesting, is there's another part of the human family out there somewhere, and they showed up here, which is very interesting because that's an idea you find echoed in some of the Magic 12 documents, which is very, very odd, and they state something very peculiar. And I'm not trying to say I'm for or against their authenticity. I'm just telling people
they are definitely interesting. Yes.
Yeah, they're very, very, very interesting. One of them says that they have to, after supposedly examining alien bodies, that science has to adjust itself to the fact that the human form, the human genus, might not be simply an evolutionary accident on Earth. It might belong to some higher order of reality. In other words, what they're suggesting there is evolution takes a certain course that leads inevitably to a hominid intelligent life form, aka man. So, it's all very, very interesting. It's all kind of interconnected.
Exactly. So back to, I guess, in the ancient times, or back to Adam and Eve, where does this, because of course, especially over the past couple of years in the news, we've been hearing a lot about the Rh negative blood. Now, where does, according to your research, Joseph, where does this fit into the picture here? And what is exactly the Rh negative blood? Because it seems like there's a lot of researchers out there that have their own theories and ideas on that.
Actually, I'm gonna demur on that question. There's a researcher out there by the name of Will Hart that you should talk to about that subject. I think he's come as close to it, and I don't want to steal his thunder. Um, I think he would be a good one to have on to ask that question to. The problem, I'll just kind of try and set up the problem should you be able to get a hold of him. Rh negative blood is something very, very unique to Caucasians, to Europeans, to us, basically. The rest of the human population doesn't seem to have this problem, although there are, if you examine other large population groups, there are certain genetic things that they have to contend with themselves. So, whatever happened, there's something that suggests that a certain segment of the human population, a small one, has some sort of genetic uh, defect or difference, and that's all I want to say on it. I think Hart is probably the one you want to go to because he's made in this case he's made the most, I think, ingenious study.
Yeah, I've watched a few of
Yeah.
his things exactly, and yes, I will definitely. He's actually on my to do list, but
Good.
I actually do have a to do list. It's actually on my wall right there, and his name is. But it's a lot of things I got to do. I'm a procrastinator, Joseph.
So am I.
Because especially when it comes to books, just like I'll be reading. I don't know, which I've read this book before. I'll be reading Genesis Revisited by Zechariah Sitchin, and I'll pick it up, I read it, and then I'll read, I don't know, something else. I'll read one of your books or whatever. But do you think that there were multiple atoms? Because there's other researchers also that talk about multiple atoms and that there were many different races of atoms. It wasn't just one singular atom like it states in the Bible.
Well, actually the Bible, if you read the New Testament, states that there's two, Christ being the second Adam. I think in terms of spiritual and original content, I'll stick with the biblical point of view that there's actually two. But in terms of this type of speculation that we're talking now, in terms of texts that suggest at some point there's a genetic modification, I think it's entirely possible that that would be the case. And once you've opened the door to a genetic intervention at some point between, the rise of human beings in the genus Homo to modern man, there might have been several genetic interventions. The only way that you're going to be able to determine that is to go back and sort out the haplogroups. And interestingly enough, it does appear that you get certain very specific types of genetic composition of human populations. Whether that's due to the natural processes of evolution or if it's due to somebody coming down and deliberately tinkering, that remains to be seen. I suspect eventually that we're going to come closer and closer to the texts. I've seen this happen over and over again in my research, and it wouldn't surprise me that it would happen here. I think you have to be very careful once you start down that path, however, because what you're doing in some of these cases where you've had people take the idea of different root races, Madame Blavatsky being, primary example of this, that teaching is so easily twisted into saying, well, this group or that group is not fully human because, they've got XYZ bloodline and not ABC bloodline. And, you end up with Hitler and the Holocaust and all that. To me, the principal genetic marker of a species is if it can breed with supposedly another species and perpetuate that creation. And in that case, humans can obviously breed with each other, whether you're Caucasian or Chinese or Swahili or what have you. It's the same genetic stuff.
But of course, you write about the war in the heavens. You talk about the cosmic war, which is one of your books. Now, it seems to be there aren't very many texts out there that talk about these ancient cosmic wars. Not a whole
Right.
lot. Now, one is the Mahabharata.
Right.
But according to your research, now even in the past, because I know you looked at this in the past, or maybe some new things that you have maybe contemplated in your own mind,
Mhm.
how many different wars are we actually looking at, and what do you think was the main culprit for these wars, Joseph?
The main culprit? You mean the main instigator
The
of
main,
it?
yes, like what is the meat and potatoes behind behind these wars? Because most of these wars were between, I guess you could call them ETs or the gods in the heavens,
Mhm.
correct?
Well, the war tradition is something that I get very frustrated when I think of the rest of the alternative community. Because there's a certain school out there that wants to have everything, way back when being all jonquils and daisies. And if, to me, this is an egregious case of ignoring what mythologies and ancient texts actually say, because, you've got a war of the gods tradition in everybody from Mesopotamia through the Greeks, through the Egyptians, through the Romans. You've got conflict, even if you examine it carefully enough. You've got conflict in Chinese mythology. You've got conflict in the Mesoamerican mythologies. So something's going on. There's some sort of war. Now, the real question is, what's the cause of the war, and why are they fighting?
Mm-hmm.
And here, I think the most helpful traditions are precisely the Mesopotamian tradition and the Vedic tradition, because they both imply two very remarkable things. Number one, that this conflict is taking place within the pantheon of the gods. So, in other words,
Mm-hmm.
it's a civil war. It's like, I draw the analogy to World War One, because you've basically got the royal house of Great Britain and Germany and Austria-Hungary and Russia and Italy. They're all related to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kaiser Wilhelm is Queen Victoria's grandson, for crying out loud, and he's the cousin of the czar. So it's a big family feud. That's what the text suggests, particularly the Mesopotamian texts. And the other thing that is very interesting about these texts is that they suggest, particularly the Mesopotamian texts, they suggest that the war is being fought over who gets to possess and control technologies of mass destruction. So, in other words, they're fighting with those technologies, and they're fighting for the possession, the sole monopoly possession of those technologies. And again, that's a very modern sort of idea, with the
Yeah.
advent of nuclear weapons. The nuclear powers have been trying to prevent other people from getting nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So it started off with the USA, and then the Russians cracked the monopoly, and then the French and the British. So
Yep.
everybody jumped on the bandwagon. So this is what suggests to me that these texts have to be taken seriously, because they're talking about a very, very similar situation. You've got technologies of mass destruction that they're fighting over, and that they're fighting for, and that they're fighting with. And the most interesting thing that popped out at me when I was writing Cosmic War was that it looked like some of these technologies were biometrically activated. In other words, you had to have the right retina scan, or the right blood type, or whatever, the right DNA sequence to make this stuff work. And that was suggestive, because if that's the case, let's stop and speculate here. If that's the case, and you're Joseph Stalin or Mikhail Gorbachev or President Clinton or who have you, and you want to get your hands on that technology, if you suspect it's biometrically activated, what else are you going to do? Well, you're going to go looking for the appropriate bloodline or genetic makeup or retinal scan, whatever it may be, to make the stuff work.
Now, with this war, you said it was more over technology aspect part of it,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
angle.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you think that it is possible they were fighting over us because we are actually, I hate to say this, we're here on Earth in this prison planet.
Mhm. Well, I think it's both. I think you have both motivations. I do think that for whatever reason, humanity is viewed as a prize and as a battlefield. Um, and certainly this war was fought with sophisticated technology. Um, in fact, in the Cosmic War, I put an epic, a Babylonian epic called the Epic of Ninurta. And I've mentioned this many times in different interviews and public speaking engagements. If you read this thing, I put the whole thing in the Cosmic War just to have people read this, because I defy anybody with an ounce of common sense to read this thing and tell me it's an epic, because it reads like the index to the Sears catalog. It's it's about that exciting, because it's nothing but an inventory. That's all it is, And I may be a clueless hack from South Dakota, but I never figured out why academics are calling this an epic, other than that's what the text says it is. But it's that's an inventory, not an epic. When I think of epic, I'm thinking of Homer. But
Yeah.
um, but uh, this text is an inventory of some of the technology that was used to fight this war. Some of it was taken off and reused in other applications. Some of it was destroyed, and there's a very small category of stuff that couldn't be destroyed that was apparently very destructive, so they hid it, okay, so that you couldn't use it again. And again, this is so modern. It's like the end of World War One. 100 years ago, we're fighting World War One. And at the end of World War One, we tell the Germans, well, don't build any more of this stuff. We've
Yeah,
had it
really.
with that. And what do? Well, we set up military attaches and spies to spy on the Germans and make sure it doesn't happen again. And we put a demilitarized zone in the Rhineland, west of the Rhine River. The Germans are not allowed to have anything military whatsoever in that part of Germany. So, push back the mobilization jumping off points. So, you look at the ancient texts and you see the same thing. Well, you see an inventory being made. You see certain stuff being prohibited or denied or hidden. And then you get even the idea of a quarantine zone if you read certain texts like Enoch, for example, where again you have the idea that there's this demilitarized zone somewhere out there in outer space around planet Earth. So yeah, I've long suspected, to walk way out onto the end of the twig of speculation here, that if you are the post-World War II American establishment and the space race is just beginning, and you've been reading these ancient texts, that there's some sort of demilitarized zone out there somewhere, folks. There's some sort of cosmic Versailles Treaty in place. We may not want to be sending space probes out there without those little plaques that say "We come in peace for all mankind." Is that just a lovely sentiment that we were expressing? Or was there a proper reason for that? And what I'm suggesting is that all the texts are suggesting that there's a reason that they may have been doing that. That they may have been afraid that, our cousins are still out there and they're still watching us. And interestingly enough, after World War II, what do we have showing up all of a sudden in vast amounts? UFOs.
UFOs, yep.
So to me, it makes a little sense.
And David Icke talks about the schism. Now, I'm not there. There's many other researchers that kind of talk about this as well, but Emmanuel Velikovsky, there's a quote by him: "The memory of the cataclysms were erased not because of lack of written traditions, but because of some characteristic process that later caused entire nations, together with their literate men, to read into these traditions allegories or metaphors where actually cosmic disturbances were clearly described." Now, we kind of talked about how there's not many texts out there that talk about the war in the heavens. Mahabharata, that's one of them. Now, with that being said, he states that very well, but do you think that the gods erased that from our memory when we were genetically modified or created?
Well, it's possible. I mean, if you're going to entertain the idea of a genetic intervention with humanity, then you have to entertain the idea of an intervention for information control. Uh, one of the things I encounter all the time in arguing for a cosmic war hypothesis is that I'm taking those texts that refer to that very literally, and I'm attempting to interpret even what they say at times about purported weapons that the gods are using. I'm trying to interpret that from a kind of literal modern scientific standpoint. It's interesting that if you look at these very same texts from a quote unquote academic point of view, they're going to look at it precisely as Velikovsky suggested, as well, these are metaphors. And there's even a school in alternative research that takes those texts as metaphors, but as metaphors of natural occurring cosmic catastrophes rather than as a description of an actual war. And the reason they do this is because so many of the names of the ancient gods are also the names of planets. Okay, Tiamat in the Babylonian tradition, Nergal, in other words, Mars, is the Babylonian name for Mars, as well as the Babylonian name for the god, Nergal. So, they say, well, these are just names of planets, and what they're really describing are metaphors. My problem with that is that academics will also tell you that if you look at these ancient texts, they use a form of writing that there's even an academic term for it. It's called paronomasia. And what that means is that the texts are written with several levels of meaning that are supposed to be understood at the same time. It's like Baroque music. It's got several lines of music, all flowing at the same time, and they're all doing their own thing, and it's all making sense. Well, that's the way these texts are written. They're written on several levels. So it becomes possible, if you view things that way, to take the cosmic war descriptions in these texts as literal cosmic wars that are describing interplanetary wars, and at the same time are describing planets by titular names of the people that control them. And we do this today. We say the Kremlin said, or the White House said, or in World War I, the Sublime Porte said. So in other words, we're describing a physical place, but what we're also trying to describe is the ruler of that particular large region. I think this is what you see in these ancient texts. They're using titular names to describe the planets that are involved in these wars and the leaders of those planets at that time. So in other words, I don't think ultimately that you have much of an argument for viewing these things simply as natural catastrophes, because when you do that, you're ruling out one possibility that the texts are implying very clearly. So that's the way I approach it.
Very well said, Joseph. Very well said. And we got to skip forward because I only have about 20 more minutes with you, because I'm trying to connect the dots here, which your research is so perfectly done, connecting the dots. They all work together. It's not like you got a book about A and then a book about Z. They're more closely interconnected here. They're not,
they are.
Far left and far right. So let's go and skip forward just a little bit. We kind of have a little bit of groundwork for the audience, a little bit of groundwork. So now, there's so many names, Joseph. Where does the Cabal fit in? Where does the Illuminati fit in? Where does the elite fit in? Because if we can go so many different angles. If we are a prison planet, or there has been rumors of wars for centuries, especially in the heavens. Now, with our creators, do you think that they are working alongside with these figureheads, these different names, Illuminati, Cabal, Elite, along the centuries
Hmm.
and kind of turning just like a car steering wheel, steering the world and the rest of society in the direction that the creator, the gods, the ETs, whatever they want us to go towards.
Well, short answer, yes. I mean, you have indications of that in almost any tradition that you look at. You know, the New Testament with Satan tempting Christ, behold, I can give you all the kingdoms of the earth if you just bow down and worship me.
Hmm.
There's a clear indication of some sort of political agenda going on here. Um, you find this over and over again. My basic model since writing The Cosmic War has been that that war caused such destruction that basically both elites in that war survived, and that they attempted to jumpstart humanity back on the
Hmm.
progress, towards civilization once again. And because of that, at certain times they made common cause because they had to, and that therefore the moral, so to speak, the moral standing of each of these elites becomes somewhat muddled. Who's the good guys? Who's the bad guys? That said, I do not. I do not view the contemporary world as being controlled by only one all encompassing master plan with a master elite coordinating every little thing. To me, what it looks like more is, again, World War One, where you had all these houses that are related to each other, but essentially they're fighting each other for global hegemony. It's like a mafia. In other words, you've got all
Hmm.
the capos around their table smoking their cigars and sipping their brandy and kissing each other's rings, while out on the streets you've got their soldiers fighting each other. That's exactly what it looks like to me. As to who these elites would be, certainly financial elites, secret societies, people practicing occult things, intelligence agencies. You throw the whole 9 yards in it, and you get basically a mess with lots of factions and interest groups and so on involved. I think, um, without getting into detail, I think that there has been a Western elite, certainly, at least since the Republic of Venice, that has been trying to steer things in a certain direction. They were ultimately successful in World War One, but not entirely. And since then, things have begun to start breaking down.
Do you think that they're influenced though by the ETs? Do you think that they're influenced? Maybe that's one reason why the the Nazis were working with the, I don't know, they were trying to get in, they were trying to, they were using the Thule Society. Were they using different methodologies like this to try to reach, I guess, spiritually or mentally, consciously, trying to get in touch with the higher power, the whatever you want to call it, the God, that some extraterrestrials out there? Were they trying to get in touch with the dark side? If you catch my drift.
Well, they certainly were in touch with it. I mean, their track record's pretty
Uh
clear.
huh.
But um, that's a difficult question.
I might be. I know I'm asking you to speculate a little bit. Just give me your gut feeling.
Well, the trouble is, it's such a difficult question that even the gut feeling is not something I can do in a cliff notes. Let me put it this way: in the Nazi books, I've had people attack me for these things, right and left, in the alternative community, because number one, I don't go to ET. I get the argument. Well, the Nazis had this explosion of technology in the 12 years, that they were ruling Germany, and that could only have come from ET. And I say nonsense, because if every human advance, breathtaking that it may be, is coming from ET, my argument is, well, okay, pretty soon we're going to have to start crashing our stuff on ET's homeworld so they can catch back up with us. This is an epistemological position that takes us nowhere and prevents us from looking at the papers in physics and engineering that may account for some of those Nazi developments. That, I think, is really the key.
It's like
But
turning our power over.
right,
Yes.
it's precisely. I think the first thing you do when you're confronted with an advanced technology is, can you reverse engineer that technology or the process of reasoning that led to it from an examination of papers in the scientific or engineering literature? And in the Nazis' case, I think you can. Now, the spiritual side of this is that Nazism grows on a philosophical soil that has basically, by that point in Europe, rejected God. And as a consequence of this, it comes to reject morality. And the only morality that it has is the acquisition and use of power without any restraints. If you translate that into a scientific sort of culture, basically you end up with, well, anything that science has a mind to do, go ahead and do it if it increases our power. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this over and over again in the Third Reich, from their military operations to, Hitler's decree for the invasion of Russia, which he clearly intends to be a genocidal
Mm-hmm.
military campaign, to the decree that sets up the SS Ahnenerbe, which is, that secret occult research bureau that Heinrich Himmler sets up inside of Germany. Anything that increases the power, be it occult, be it standard physics, anything whatsoever, they're willing to look at. In that sense, I think there is a spiritual component to Nazi Germany. And in that sense, yes, I think it becomes very clear that they subject themselves to a philosophical openness to quote unquote dark powers. But every attempt I've seen where people have tried to make the case that this is at the core of Nazism falls short of making it absolutely academic. The best scholarly examination of that topic, I think, still remains Nicholas Goodrich Clark, the Oxford scholar that's looked into that. And he makes a very, very good case. But, it's not a case dependent on crash flying saucers and channeling extraterrestrials or any of
Mm-hmm.
that. If you're expecting that, it's not that at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more along the lines that I've outlined. I hope that helps.
Yeah, exactly. You do state things very well, Joseph, and I always love chatting with you. This first video interview I've ever had with you, but with okay, trying to skip forward, with the little time that we have, trying to connect
Mm-hmm.
these dots here.
Mm-hmm.
Now they were trying to get not just the Nazis,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of world leaders. They want this technology, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
technology is. They
Mm-hmm.
want the secret of the ancients.
Mm-hmm.
They want the technology of the ancients. And
Mm-hmm.
now, is that why so many people are interested in Antarctica? Because before we get into Antarctica, is it because you talk about the breakaway civilization?
Mm-hmm.
Many other researchers do too. Now, many people believe that we never went to the moon because of the Van Allen belt. Now,
Mm-hmm.
quick answer, yes or no? Quick answer,
Uh,
yes or no?
to what? To
Did,
what question?
did we go to the moon?
I think so. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, but that was one reason why people are interested in Antarctica. That's part of where the breakaway civilization is, or maybe eventually will occur because they can break past the Van Allen belt. But despite that, because you gave me your answer about the moon, now what exactly is in Antarctica? What's beneath the ice, in your opinion? Is there lost advanced technology from the ancients? Is that possibly Atlantis there, or is that where? Because before the Pangea occurred, it was all the continents were pretty close. So just give me your answer on that.
Well, my answer is in a new book that just came out. It's called Hess and the Penguins.
Hmm.
Um,
I'm ready to read it.
uh, yeah. If you stop and think of Antarctica, and I may go a little long here
No, take
in
your
my
time,
answer.
Joseph, but just take your time
Um,
on because Antarctica. This is about why the breakaway civilization with Antarctica. This is about where we're going to end the show right here. So,
okay. Well, first of all, the term breakaway civilization is not my own. It's Richard Dolan's term. He came up with this term because he was considering certain implications of what he was finding in his research about the Black Project's world in relationship to UFOs. And basically, he speculates that with enough money and secret research over time, you would begin to develop a separate civilization on planet Earth that had access to technologies far in advance of anything known in the public realm. And because of that, and I think this is a key crucial component that Dolan implies in his remarks, because of that, you would have an entirely different culture of decision making taking place in that civilization. In other words, even the ethics and morality of it would shift. And again, you see kind of a hint of this in Nazi Germany. You see it coming to the fore in the transhumanist movement that's now so much a part of the public discussion. But Antarctica fits into this because if you stop and look at the strange list of people that are connected with Antarctica, it's just downright bizarre. Because you have the Nazi expedition that went to Antarctica in late 1938, early 1939. Well, that expedition was sponsored by Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, the founder of the Gestapo and the founder of the German Luftwaffe, okay, and the head of it. So this is a military guy, folks. This is like putting General Patton in charge of an Antarctic expedition. So, this guy is not sponsoring a science fair project. In other words, he's got something that he wants to accomplish in the long term for Nazi Germany by sending a bunch of people down to Antarctica. And I definitely think, for various reasons, I don't want to get into here, I definitely think Rudolf Hess was involved with this, particularly given Hess's position inside the Nazi hierarchy before he flew off to England on that crazy peace mission, okay? I definitely think Hess was involved with this. He would have had to have known about it and about whatever was found there. So Hermann Goering, professional military man, founder of the Gestapo, Rudolf Hess, head of the Nazi Party, major interest in the occult. And then after the war, we find Admiral Richard Byrd with Operation High Jump, the American military expedition in 1947, which was planned, get this, by Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. Okay, now Forrestal ought to ring little alarm bells. Okay. Then, leaping forward to just this year and last year, in the middle of one of the most hotly contested elections in American presidential history, we have the American Secretary of State, the chief diplomat of the United States of America, going on a diplomatic junket around the world. And oh, lo and behold, he decides he's going to take a little side junket down to Antarctica, and we're told that Secretary Kerry had a kind of a personal interest in studying global climate change, and that was the reason for his trip. And then a few weeks later, we have Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin going to Antarctica. He gets sick and has to be flown out of there. And then, prior to all of that, guess who else decides to go to Antarctica? Why, Kirill III, Patriarch of Moscow. So if you add all of this up, you've got Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, Richard Byrd, James Forrestal, John Kerry, Buzz Aldrin, and Patriarch Kirill III, just to list 7 people.
That's just the ones that we know about.
Well, there's King Juan Carlos of Spain, Prince Harry or William, one of the two, from Great Britain. So in other words, there's this bizarre list of people that have been to Antarctica, and they're not talking. So you mentioned Atlantis. Let's look at Antarctica from that point of view, because if there's one place on planet Earth that would fit the basic bill in Plato's dialogues describing Atlantis as a submerged continent that was very warlike, it's Antarctica. Why? Because Antarctica's under a heck of a lot of ice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the next question is, well, what are they finding down there? And I want to be very clear here. I do not subscribe to the idea that the Nazis established some super secret UFO flying saucer research base in Antarctica. I do not subscribe to hollow earth theories and that Admiral Byrd flew inside the hollow earth or any of that nonsense, okay? I do, however, think it is possible that in their aerial reconnaissance, the German expedition was outfitted with 2 seaplanes that were supposed to map a certain region of Antarctica photographically. And the same thing holds true with Admiral Byrd's expedition after the war. I do think it is possible that they found something that may have given them pause and that the secrecy was clamped down, because we know virtually nothing about the German expedition. Byrd wrote a 100-page plus article in National Geographic, which basically tells us nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I know.
other than a lot of scientific minutia. But it doesn't tell us, number one, why did we have to go all the way down there? This was the story they put out. Why do we have to go all the way down there to test our military equipment to see how it would function in Arctic conditions? We've got Alaska for that. We don't need to outfit an expensive military and naval expedition to the other hemisphere to do this.
Exactly.
So, the whole thing is suspect to me. And I do suspect that if there's any one thing that might lie, and again, I'm speculating, there's no evidence for this other than some strange photographs that pop up on the internet every now and then that suggest they may have found remains of a civilization there. But the problem there is with these photographs and stories, there's no corroboration. These are all coming from very suspicious and in some cases just downright untrustworthy sources.
Yeah.
But that's my suspicion, that they found something.
My gut tells me, Joseph, I didn't mean to cut you off. My gut tells me
that's okay.
is that this big interest in Antarctica is because I feel like there's a connection with the breakaway civilization and Antarctica. Now, just give me your cliff notes if there is about that. About the connection.
Well, my cliff notes version would be this: if you are intent upon setting up secret testing places or anything like that, the one place on planet Earth that would be the most inaccessible and the least surveilled from the standpoint of satellites and so on, it would be Antarctica. So if you want to keep things secret, and if you've got the money and logistical support to do it, that would be the place to do it. So yeah, I think you could have a breakaway component there. And lo and behold, guess what? Famous American defense contractor has a presence in Antarctica.
Who's that?
Lockheed Martin.
Yes. Exactly. Yep. I think I've heard Michael Sala talk about that too. And for the final question, are you ready for the big shabam?
I'm not going to Michael Sala, but
no, not about Michael Sala. Now, for the final question, you ready for the big shabam, the $1 million question?
Sure.
To sum it all up, Joseph, just take your time, cliff notes, or whatever you want to do. This is the last final question. What is the ultimate agenda of the ancient of old times? With the cabal, the elite, or whatever you want to call them, what is the ultimate agenda for the human race?
Well, it depends on which cabal you're talking about.
Well, the ones that many theorize.
The bad ones?
Yes.
Their agenda, in a nutshell, is the destruction of the human race. mass sacrifice and world hegemony.
And is that why they want to break away? Is to kill us off and then break away?
I don't think that. No, I don't think that the human-based breakaway civilization. Again, you're asking me to paint in monolithic, either or.
Yeah.
And I simply am not that way. I think there's a group here on Earth that is totally demonic in terms of its agenda.
I agree.
In terms of what it's willing to do to achieve that agenda. And I also think that there's other groups that are not that at all. And certainly I don't think that the breakaway group after World War II started out that way. It may have become that, or it may have certain elements within it that became that. But I think they were confronted, with and I've talked about this in the Secret Space Program conferences. I think they were confronted by a strategic problem that was a real nightmare. And they had to set certain things up in order to address what essentially was a threefold post-war threat. And to address it effectively, the chief and biggest one of those things being the UFO phenomenon. And I think what they were thinking about is trying to prevent. These were not stupid men. These were people that would have had at least some exposure to, this body of ancient lore that suggested interference from the gods or even interventions from the gods to prevent humanity from achieving certain things. Think of the Tower of Babel moment in the Bible. Well, Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, was the son of a Presbyterian minister. So he, this is going to be drilled into him. They're looking at all of this, and they're trying to figure out how do we respond to this and keep, from their secular point of view, keep human independence and action free from interference from anybody, God or the devils or whoever. And I think what they come up with, looking at the UFO, is a program where they say we are going to have to demonstrate at some point an ability to engineer systems of a planetary and perhaps even stellar scale in order to scare these people and show them that we can do this while we, in the meantime, try to achieve some sort of technological parity with what they're doing. I think that's uppermost in their minds. And to a certain extent, I think they succeeded. Even, Colonel Corso suggests as much. But at some point, I do think that when you're traveling down that road, when you are trying to access that kind of sophisticated power and technology, that you open yourself to the corruptions it brings, the spiritual corruptions it brings. Lord Acton, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's the Farrell corollary that the corrupt seek power. Mm-hmm. So to a certain extent, I think these people are also pursuing this for their own advantage. So in a nutshell, that would be my agenda. But again, I want to stress that I don't believe in one grand unified conspiracy theory. I believe what you really have is a kind of a Miltonian mafia war with all these factions, and they're coming close to the end game, and they know it, and they want to be the faction on top of it all, and that's why things are breaking down.
I think you're exactly right.
You see some really strange stuff going on.
Well, Joseph, I tell you what, man, I can talk to you for hours, days, because, you have so many books, and just like I stated before, they all interconnect. They all make one big, enormous picture. Like you get a puzzle piece here, book here, book here. Each book is like a big, giant puzzle piece, and it makes a better picture, a better understanding, a better intellectual. It makes you just think beyond the edge, beyond the veil, and because
I hope so.
This world is so mysterious, and
it is.
And hence mysterious outpost. This is a cool place to hang out. What do you think, Joseph?
I'm game.
But anyways, I really appreciate your time. I'm going to give the link to all your books in the description because we did pretty much cover bits and pieces of many of your books. And people can check out all your books. And Joseph, I appreciate it, man. I salute you. And you are a phenomenal researcher, and you have a good evening, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on, Mike.